In 1986, the city of Cleveland wanted to create a celebration everyone would remember. The plan was to release almost 1.5 million balloons into the sky, and at first it looked incredible. A huge, colorful cloud rose above the city. People looked up, cameras captured the record attempt, and the crowd cheered. But then the weather changed, and those balloons started coming back down. Onto the streets, onto the roads, near the airport, and into Lake Erie. What was supposed to be a beautiful symbol of the city became one of the strangest public event failures in American history. At the time, Cleveland wanted to show a brighter image of itself. The city had been through difficult years, and organizers wanted something big, colorful, and positive. Balloonfest '86 was planned as a charity event for United Way, and also as an attempt to set a world record. The idea sounded simple: build a huge structure in the center of the city, fill it with balloons, and release them all at once. The balloons were tied to small donations. Volunteers spent hours filling them with helium. Public Square slowly turned into a giant net holding a sea of color. On paper, it looked perfect. The problem was that nobody can fully control the sky. On September 27th, tens of thousands of people gathered in downtown Cleveland. Above Public Square was a massive net filled with balloons. Below it were volunteers, around it were spectators, journalists, and cameras. When the balloons were released, the moment really was beautiful. Almost 1.5 million colored dots rose into the air and surrounded the city's towers. For a few minutes, Cleveland looked like a celebration had exploded into the sky. People applauded. The organizers got the image they wanted, but very quickly it became clear that there were too many balloons. The plan was for the balloons to rise high and scatter, but the weather had other ideas. Rain and wind pushed them back down. Instead of disappearing into the sky, the balloons began landing across the city. They fell onto streets, got in the way of drivers, covered yards, trees, and rooftops. Some came down near the airport, causing problems for flights, but the worst part was on the water. A huge number of balloons ended up in Lake Erie. From the surface, they could look like heads or floating debris, and that made a search operation on the lake harder. At that point, the story stopped being just a funny mistake. Balloonfest was supposed to be the day Cleveland showed itself as bright, bold, and alive. Instead, it became an example of how a beautiful idea can get out of control when it becomes too large. The organizers wanted a celebration. They did not plan for traffic problems, airport disruptions, or thousands of balloons covering the water, but scale changed everything. One balloon is almost nothing. 1,000 balloons can be decoration, but 1.5 million balloons become a force of their own. After Balloonfest, people began to look at mass balloon releases differently. What once seemed harmless and beautiful started to look like a risk for cities, water, animals, and people. The strangest part of this story is that the first few minutes of Balloonfest really were spectacular. If you only watch the release, it almost looks perfect. A city, a crowd, the sky, and a colorful cloud rising above the buildings. But that is not why the event is remembered. It is remembered because of what happened after. The balloons that were supposed to fly away came back down and proved something simple. Sometimes the problem is not the idea itself, but the scale. Cleveland tried to send a celebration into the sky. Instead, it released 1.5 million tiny consequences.